morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
We're going to get today started, as we often do on Tuesdays, by speaking with Ambassador David Comissiong. Now, he hasn't been on island, but there's so much going on across our region that we want to catch up. So good morning. Welcome. Good to see you.
Good morning, Tisha. Pleasure to be here.
I hope you're having a good week already.
Well, yeah, it's been a pretty good week. It's a good week for me if it's a productive week, and it's been a productive week.
Yeah, I won't get into that because productive.
And there was the official launch of Crop Over.
That's right, over the weekend.
Yeah.
Did you get an opportunity to check that out?
I was there from beginning to end. From the beginning of the ceremonial delivery of the last skeins to almost the very end of the Calypso tent in Independence
Yeah,
Square.
that was quite a to-do. Yeah, from the parade all the way up, and then the officialities.
Yeah. My only regret is that quite a few people told me that they didn't know about it. And that parade, I mean, every Barbadian child really should have been there to experience that parade. So I think we need to, events like that, we need to find a way to make sure that the whole population is informed.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. It was meant to be at the Botanical Gardens. So the switch was really in short order. So the changes were major. I think the press conference to kind of announce everything was only on Thursday. So that literally gave like one full day and just a bit to be able to promote the change.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But it was a great event. And CBC TVA will be showing it again soon. So everybody will get a chance to see it, of course. Before we get into talking about what you've been up to as you were in St. Martin, I'd like to touch on what's been going on in the Caribbean a little bit, if you don't mind, after the passage of
this
Hurricane Beryl.
This snippet from the speech in St. Martin is very much connected to Beryl. Because I was invited to the Governor's Symposium in St. Martin, and I basically was speaking about reparations and decolonization. But in explaining reparations, I was making the point that there is an aspect of reparations that has to deal with a reform and restructuring of the international economic order and the international institutions to be much more facilitatory of the development of countries like ours that went through centuries of enslavement and exploitation. And I zeroed in on the climate crisis and compensation for climate injustice. And what Beryl represents is an example of climate injustice. So this snippet from the speech really sets the background for a deeper understanding of Beryl and what should be our response to Beryl.
All right, well, with that said, let's take a listen to the clip and come on back. Of course, this is the address that the ambassador gave at the Governor's Symposium in St. Martin on Friday, the 28th of June. And he explained a bit about what it was all about.
We have to look at restructuring that order. We in CARICOM, and especially in Barbados, we have captured a number of those demands under a rubric that we call the Bridgetown Initiative. So these are demands for a restructuring of the international institutions. These institutions are not doing enough to cater to the Black and brown nations of the world, those nations whose people were subjected to centuries of looting and plundering of their resources. Our ancestors worked generation after generation and never got to appropriate or to keep or to enjoy any of the fruits of their labor. Fruits of their labor were siphoned off. European families, European companies, institutions, and ultimately to the capitals of Europe. The beginnings of Europe's industrial civilization is right here in the Caribbean. In the 1640s, there were no factories in Europe. If you wanted to find a factory in the 1640s, you had to go to places like Barbados. the fields of sugar cane to grow the cane, the windmill to grind the sugar cane to produce cane juice, then the sugar factory or boiling house to put that cane juice through various heating and chemical processes to produce sugar, molasses, rum. Who ran those? That was the beginning of Europe's Industrial Revolution. And who ran those proto-industrial enterprises in the Caribbean? They call them slaves. But when you look behind that general term slave, you saw carpenter, blacksmith, cooper, sugar factory boiler. It was our enslaved ancestors. And many of them brought the skills used to develop that proto-industrial economy from Africa. How do we know that? Well, the historical records show that, for example, if you look at carpenters on the sugar plantations, that a disproportionate number of those who were carpenters were actually Africa-born, as opposed to, Creoles born in the Caribbean, which tells you that they brought these skills with them from the continent of Africa. So, as Walter Rodney said, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, Europe's development was purchased at the price of the systematic looting and plundering of not only the continent of Africa, but of the sons and daughters of Africa in the Caribbean. And so, because of that history, we now, the black and brown nations of the world that went through that historical experience, we now have a fundamental right to development. And the nations and institutions that benefited from our systematic underdevelopment are now under a corresponding fundamental duty to facilitate our development. And so, whether you're talking World Bank, IMF, Inter-American Development Bank, they all need to be restructured to be much, much more facilitatory of our development. We must restructure the terms of international trade. We must restructure the currently inequitable rules of international finance and international economic governance. We must be paid compensation for climate injustice because our ancestors were enslaved to help Europe develop an industrial economy. That industrial economy went on to bring enormous wealth to Europe, but at the expense of creating all these greenhouse gases that have caused the global warming that manifests now in ferocious hurricanes, sargassum seaweed invasions, droughts that now affect our countries. And we are feeling those negative effects. So we have been disadvantaged twice. Our ancestors were exploited to build the industry that went on to create wealth for Europe, but to generate greenhouse gases. And now we are on the front line of the climate crisis. So the Bridgetown Initiative says no. We must be compensated to be able to adapt and to mitigate the climate crisis.
Absolutely. That of course deals with exactly what we were talking about. A great segue into exactly what's happening in our region right now.
Yes, we were severely impacted by Hurricane Beryl. At least 9 of our CARICOM territories. You're talking Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, Jamaica, Cayman, Haiti also experienced some damage, and then it petered off as it got towards Belize. So one hurricane that has impacted so many of our countries at the very beginning of the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season. We still have about 5 months to go. And the thing about Beryl is that Beryl is a history-making hurricane. Beryl is on record as the earliest hurricane to develop into a Category 5 hurricane. No other hurricane has become a Category 5 hurricane this early in the hurricane season. And that was caused by record sea level surface level temperatures. So this is a sign of things to come. You know, for decades, Barbados had not been hit by a hurricane. You know, we had to go back to 1955 with Jeanette. Then we had Elsa. Now we have Beryl. And so it is telling us that the climate crisis is here with us.
All right, so there are a few terms that, you know, that we've been hearing a lot of. 1.5 to stay alive, obviously speaking about the climate generally and the rise in temperatures and so on. But also we know that the Bridgetown Initiative has kind of been shared all across the globe in, you know, various places, particularly in Canada, you know, to a lot of major players and so on. Where are we with it? Because we heard a lot of people talking about how great it is, what a wonderful initiative it is, how good it would be for small island developing states. But where are we with things like the Bridgetown Initiative and other things that really tie into it when we talk about climate financing and being able to build up ourselves really so that we're resilient and not only reactive at times like this, so that we're able to really build on the infrastructure for our West Coast, for example, and South Coast, where we've been able to put the boardwalks in, which really are meant to kind of help to mitigate some of the damages that we saw and so on. Where are we with these things with the international community, who really are the people who need to sign on to these initiatives?
Well, I think that we have made the most success, I would say, with the climate-related parts of the Bridgetown Initiative. So, for example, the Bridgetown Initiatives call for debt pause clauses in our borrowing instruments, such that you put in a clause that says, if you are hit by a major natural disaster like a hurricane, and a certain level of damage is done, you are entitled to pause your debt payments for 2 years so that you can focus all of your resources on rebuilding. I think that has been a success. That has been pretty widely accepted by a large number of developing countries and a number of the international financial institutions. Secondly, the Bridgetown Initiative has zeroed in on the climate injustice and has been calling for that $100 billion that the developed industrialized countries that have caused the global warming have undertaken to pay into the UN's loss and damage fund, but have never done so. In fact, for the fund was not operationalized until last year, and you know, some of the momentum to actually push these countries to operationalize the fund obviously came from, you know, the energy behind the Bridgetown Initiative. So the fund is now, quote unquote, operationalized. Barbados has put in a request to have the management of the fund located in Barbados. We'll see what happens with that. But the pledges into the fund at last year's COP didn't even come to $1 billion, and we are saying it's supposed to be $100 billion. So we obviously still have a lot of work to do, Tisha, a lot of activism, a lot of agitation to get justice, because that fund should be available for a situation like Beryl, where St. Vincent, the countries hardest hit, St. Vincent and Grenada, should not now be having to go and borrow money on the international market to rebuild. There should be that loss and damage fund with resources that they could get grants out of that fund to rebuild. Barbados should be able to get grants out of that fund to reestablish our fishing fleet, for example. And so that is the climate justice that we're calling for. And you see, we have come to understand, you know, they say the Caribbean is the most heavily indebted region in the world. Our countries have the highest national debt. Well, why is that? A big part of that is because year after year, our countries have to be responding to climate disasters and having to be borrowing money to be constantly rebuilding and repairing because of some climate-related event, whether it's a catastrophic one like a hurricane, or it is sargassum seaweed, it is rising sea waters, having to do the coastal protection, having to do desalination plants. You know, all of this adds up. And
it's all related.
Yeah, it's
all right,
related.
We're going to take a break here. When we come back, we continue the conversation. And remember, this conversation on what's happening continues. Our Crystal Hoyt is outside of Barbados and doing stellar work all the way down the region. We're not even sure exactly where she is this morning. She's traveling along with the teams working toward recovery and rebuilding. And we're going to be checking in with her a little bit later about how things are going and sharing some of the images that have been coming in to the corporation of how Beryl has really torn up the region. There's so much that we can talk about, from building, the way we build in this part of the region, to what we do. But there are certain things that are kind of beyond our control, kind of like the notices that CBC used to put out, I heard about years ago, you know, the film has slipped the sprocket. This is beyond our control.
It doesn't happen now.
No, it doesn't. But we're there because of who we are as small island developing states.
Yeah, we in the Caribbean, we are really on the front line. We are the most exposed, you know. We are right in the line of those hurricanes that every year form off the West African coast and come straight across at us. And because of the global warming, they are becoming increasingly violent and increasingly frequent. So we have to be very, very serious about demanding climate justice. I would advocate that as SEDIMA goes through its normal process of assessing the damage done to the Caribbean territories by Beryl, that we should make sure we do this in a very rigorous and scientific way, as SEDIMA always does. Tally up that bill and present that bill to the relevant, wealthy, industrialized countries, the so-called Annex 1 countries of the Kyoto Protocol, the countries that have been identified as the ones that are really responsible for the global warming, and say to them, here is the evidence of what we have been saying all along. We must receive climate justice. We must receive compensation from you. We cannot be expected to be expensing our people for something that we're not responsible for. You know, so Barbados now, the government has to help reestablish that fishing fleet. It means that money that perhaps could have gone into the education reform program, or that could have gone to Minister Corey Lane for his peace initiative, has to be diverted, to repairing damage that ultimately we really are not responsible for. So I see that Prime Minister Dickon Mitchell has issued a public statement making this point very strongly, that this is a serious injustice to Grenada, for Grenada to have to now go and look for resources to rebuild those islands. That is just not fair. So I'm hoping that the leadership of CARICOM will make this, make Beryl, the response to Beryl, a special campaign that really helps to make the case for us to receive, for that loss and damage fund to be treated much more seriously, and for us to be put in a position to receive reconstruction grants.
Well, ironically, he's just stepped into his role as head of CARICOM as well for his cycle. So the interesting thing is something that you touched on before, the fact that we're so early in the season. So it's a very real possibility. And I know there's a few people out there saying, don't say it, Tisha, because, we believe in in positivity. And, but the reality is we're very early in the season, as you mentioned. So, several other recovery and repair bills could potentially be down the line for 2024. So, what's the next move in terms of speaking with one clear and loud voice as a region to let the international community know that it's just not enough to say, okay, this has now been put in place, but to make it truly operational for us to be able to draw on the funds needed to reinforce really our shorelines.
Yeah. Well, we can only do what we can do, which is, we can't give them an instruction and order. We have to do the activism, the advocacy, and we have been doing that in a very admirable way. I think the CARICOM countries have always turned up at the COP conferences and have made an impact on COP. So we have driven a lot of the agenda, even the concept of 1.5 to stay alive, to set that target. You have to give a lot of credit to the CARICOM countries, both as CARICOM, but also within AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, for insisting that goal of keeping the global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 by the end of this century. You have to give us a lot of credit for establishing that as a target. So we can only continue with the advocacy, but I am thinking that because Beryl has really caught the imagination of the world. I mean, it's been on all the major newscasts and so forth, and it's not just one country, you see. But when we set up SEDIMA, the idea was that if one country is impacted, that all the rest, the resources of all the rest, will be brought to bear on helping that one country. But as things have turned out, hurricanes are not impacting just one country now. Yeah. It's multiple. So our resources are really stretched. SEDIMA's resources will be stretched. So yes, we can only do what we can do, but I think we need to make wise use of this current disaster and really get all of our diplomats, mobilized around using this to make the case in a very, very graphic way, and to do it now at the very beginning of the hurricane season, because who knows what else is coming our way.
Yeah, at the risk of sounding insensitive, but I'm hoping that people will see my point. The mere fact that we kind of have to reach out to average people and say, donate, which is not a bad thing, but we're to the place now where people used to say, bring what you have, where we're hearing we need cash. So it's a very different appeal from what we've heard in the past, and we understand why there's a need to have money to be able to do what's needed, instead of having a bunch of things donated that you might not be able to distribute as readily as you would if you had the money to be able to do it. But I think there will be some level of fatigue on the backs of the people who are kind of called upon all of the time to contribute. And that in and of itself is a challenge, because we're looking at a situation where, there might be a level of indifference when it comes to working together as a region.
Yeah, you can only go to the well so often. But, we are Caribbean people. We are accustomed to showing solidarity. They say Barbados is a Kudir society, very sympathetic and empathetic people.
We indeed are.
And so we do our best. Yes, when the hurricane first hits, there's that immediate need for material supplies. But after you get past that initial donation of material supplies, the governments tend to prefer, give us cash so that we could kind of more calibrate the needs better. And you're right, sometimes if they have a deluge of material supplies, the logistics for distribution can become problematical. So, Yes, I know St. Vincent has said, please put the emphasis on cash right
As
now,
did Grenada.
rather than the material supplies. I came here armed with the bank account details.
Yeah, we do have the information for Grenada, I
have it,
believe.
yes, we have St. Vincent and Grenada. I think when I was here last week, we featured the St. Vincent details, but Grenada also has a natural disaster relief fund. The Grenada Cooperative Bank Limited, SWIFT code GROAGDGD, and account number, it's a lot to take in, 121004900. But I guess that information is probably available.
Yeah.
On,
we put a link for people to be able to navigate to the site. Once you get online, it's very easy to navigate to the site.
But to get back to your point,
yeah,
ordinary citizens can only do so much, really and truly, if we are going to be responding to damage caused by Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. We must have that loss and damage resource in place that we can draw upon. So, unfortunately, Tisha, this is a world of injustice. It has been for a long time, and we know only too well in light of our own history. But I guess the good thing is that the genie is out of the bottle. People's eyes have opened up. In the past, they used to tell you, oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Oh, you fix that damage yourself. And a lot of us didn't recognize that, we were in a situation of injustice, where some countries had really benefited at our people's expense for centuries, had developed their own strength at the expense of our weakness, and then had the arrogance to tell us, just pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. So I think our eyes have opened up. We are now much more aware to the systemic injustices, the systemic inequalities, and I think the demand that has gone out from us. And I go back to that reparations claim that we launched in 2013. I think the reparations idea has caused us to look a lot more closely and critically at the whole world within which we live, and the structural inequalities and injustices built into that world order, and we are questioning it. And I think that questioning is only going to get louder and more piercing as we go forward. And we have to demand justice for ourselves, and a level playing field. We have to demand that this international order be much more facilitatory of us, much more protective of our interests, because it is what we are entitled to. It's not some charity we are asking for. We are looking at the whole history of how this world order emerged, and the injustice that is built into that history, and we are saying enough is enough. We want a proper deal, and that's what it's all about.
Absolutely. And what comes to mind, to be honest, is a speech Rihanna gave. It wasn't in reference to anything to do with this, but she said, if there are people who truly support you, tell them to pull up. And I think in order to be heard, which we know in the international spaces, when many of these countries need numbers to be made up, they go about lobbying to be able to get the support that they need from this part of the world. I think it's time to call in some favors and tell some people to pull up.
Yes, you say that you're our friend, you're our development
Our
partner,
ally.
and all the rest of it. Well, prove it. Here's the time to prove it, because there can be no doubt, that this is not something that we have fabricated. I mean, the evidence is so clear that we are on the front line of this climate crisis. We cannot be expected to be every year finding resources to rebuild and to repair. for something that we were not responsible for. In fact, we were the victims of it. You benefited from this process. You have all this accumulation of resources and wealth, and we assume simple justice.
Absolutely.
Give us the resources to be able to repair.
And the truth is, and again, you know, conversations like these are so delicate when you think about it, because there's so much we need to do here for our people to kind of safeguard themselves as much as they can, especially so early in the season, and looking on and seeing all that has happened. You know, there have been incentives throughout the years for people to use more hurricane straps and build differently. You know, there are changes to our building codes and things of that nature. But there's so many homes as we move around Barbados. There's so many homes here that need to get in a place where we feel like if we have a real, I can't even say a direct hit, because I mean, look at what happened with Beryl, but that these homes, these households will be able to survive,
Well,
you know, at any eventuality like that. So we really should be concentrating on reinforcing infrastructure and things like that at this point in time.
That's actually part of the thinking of the Bridgetown Initiative as well, because in addition to just focusing on the climate issues specifically, the Bridgetown Initiative also focuses on the fact that the multilateral development institutions need to have much more resources available to developing countries to address issues pertaining to poverty, better infrastructure, better housing, and so forth. And there's a link between the two. That if you know, there's a link between anti-poverty measures and climate adaptation and mitigation measures, because if a country is struggling with issues pertaining to poverty, how then do you ask that country to deal with the climate crisis, to deal with climate mitigation and adaptation? You know, so the two go together, and the Bridgetown Initiative is calling for much more resources to be made available, so that developing countries can do things like what you are talking about, where housing stock can be improved, for example. And but I guess we now need to be conscious that we are in a climate crisis. We are going to be more and more subject to these violent hurricanes. So we need to be more conscious to do what we can to improve our roofs, our hurricane shutters, etc., etc. So we need to do what we can on our own resources, but at the same time, we need to keep pressing. We need to keep pushing the Bridgetown Initiative and its call for much more resources to be made available, and to be made available on concessional terms. You know, we are talking about, even if you have to take loans for development purposes, those should be loans repaid over 30 to 50 year periods. So the whole point is these institutions need to be much more facilitatory of our development, so that we can do the things we need to do to protect our people.
All right, I want to thank you so much, Ambassador Comissiong, for coming in and sharing with us. Always insightful, but I think our conversation this morning kind of leaves a lot to be said. We certainly have to continue the conversation in the coming weeks and months as we continue on the rebuild all across the Caribbean.